Snow fell in slow, silent sheets over Bitter Creek National Reserve, covering every branch, trail, and footprint under a thick white blanket. It was the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones, turning breath to mist before it even left your lips. Rangers knew better than to wander far in weather like this. But that day, something happened no one could have imagined, something that would test courage, loyalty, and the unspoken bond between humans and dogs. Thomas Grady had spent 20 years patrolling these woods. At 42, he knew every bend of the river, every half-forgotten logging trail, and every towering pine that stood like a silent witness to passing seasons. But on this day, Thomas wasn't walking freely through the forest he loved. Instead, he hung helplessly from a gnarled old tree, heavy chains digging into his chest and pinning his arms behind him. Snow clung to his torn ranger uniform and mixed with blood that had dried 2 dark patches along his face. His breaths were shallow and ragged, steam rising faintly in the freezing air. His wrists were raw, skin split open from hours of struggling that had only tightened the iron cuffs biting into him. It had been 2 long days since Thomas was ambushed. Men in ski masks, their voices sharp with anger and greed, had demanded something Thomas couldn't give: access to restricted land deep inside the reserve, a place untouched by tourists and known only to those sworn to protect it. When he refused, they left him there to die, chained like an animal to a tree no one would think to check. Snow had erased any tracks they might have left behind. To the world, it was as if Thomas had simply vanished. But far from where Thomas hung between hope and frostbite, AK-9 unit was out on a winter training run. 5 German shepherds, each as disciplined as they were powerful, padded through the snow, their thick coats dusted white. Their handler, Rachel Vance, kept a careful eye on them, knowing how unpredictable the mountain weather could be. A sudden whiteout drifted in, blinding enough that for just a moment, she lost sight of her team. When the snow settled, the dogs were gone. At first, panic gripped Rachel's chest. She called out, her voice sharp against the hush of falling snow, but no barks answered back. The woods swallowed her words as if they'd never existed. But these weren't ordinary dogs. Trained for search and rescue, disaster relief, and to track even the faintest scent, the K9 South moved as one. Their instincts, loyalty, and training guided them away from the planned route, into the deeper, older part of the forest, where human footprints hadn't been seen in years. Through a haze of half-frozen eyelashes, Thomas heard something, a soft crunching of paws over snow, closer than the wind, yet still distant enough to doubt. His cracked lips parted, a breath of disbelief escaping. Was his mind finally slipping into hallucination? But the shapes emerged slowly, dark against the blinding white. 5 German shepherds, eyes sharp, ears perked, moving with a quiet urgency that spoke of purpose. The biggest of them stepped forward, a scar across his left eye giving him a fierce, almost noble look. He didn't bark or lunge. He simply sat, tail sweeping snow behind him, and stared at Thomas with a calmness that seemed to say, "I see you. I'm here." Thomas felt a sting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the wind. Summoning what strength he had left, he whispered, "Good boy." One of the other dogs began circling the tree, nose close to the frozen earth, sniffing at the heavy chains and lock that held Thomas captive. Another kept its gaze fixed on the forest beyond, muscles tense, as if guarding them against threats only it could sense. The scarred shepherd, eyes steady, stepped even closer, breathing in Thomas's scent and the cold, metallic bite of the chains. Then, with a sharp bark that seemed to echo through the silent woods, he signaled the others. Thomas watched through blurred eyes as they moved together, almost like they'd practiced it 1,000 times. One pawed the snow around his feet, revealing the rusted padlock buried under fresh snowfall. Another tilted its head back and barked toward the sky, a short, clipped sound, calling out not in fear, but in command. Thomas felt hope spark painfully in his chest. They weren't just here by chance. They were working. Minutes stretched on like hours. Thomas drifted in and out, the cold pulling at his senses, trying to drag him under. Just before the darkness swallowed him completely, distant shouts pierced the air. Human voices. The crunch of boots on snow grew louder until figures appeared through the drifting flakes. Rachel rushed forward, relief flashing across her face as she knelt beside Thomas. "We've got you," she said, voice shaking but steady. Her gloved hands worked quickly, freeing him from chains that had felt like they'd become part of his skin. As Thomas sagged forward, half conscious, he felt something warm press against his side. It was the scarred shepherd, his breath steady and warm against Thomas's frostbitten hand. Before the darkness claimed him, Thomas locked eyes with the dog and saw something there: understanding, loyalty, and a silent promise that he wasn't alone. When Thomas opened his eyes again, blinking against harsh fluorescent light, he smelled antiseptic and heard the steady beep of a monitor. The infirmary of the ranger station felt almost too warm, the heat sinking into frozen bones that had nearly given up. A nurse leaned over him, telling him he was safe now, that the dogs had saved him. But Thomas's first words came out hoarse and raw. "Where's the dog with the scar?" Outside the window, snow still fell, hiding secrets the forest had kept far too long. Thomas didn't know yet that those chains and that tree were only the beginning, that the real danger wasn't behind him in the woods, but waiting back at the station, hidden in uniforms and familiar faces, and that the dog who had chosen him would stand by his side for what was coming next. But for now, all he knew was that he'd been saved not by luck, but by loyalty that walked on for pause, and that the fight for truth was far from over. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of questions, quiet conversations, and uneasy sleep. Thomas spent most of his time wrapped in bandages and thick blankets, his body aching from frostbite and bruises, but his mind never rested. The ranger station that had always felt like a safe place now seemed full of shadows. Every door creaked, too loud, every radio call felt too heavy with things unsaid. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying tire tracks and footprints, as if the forest itself wanted to keep its secrets. Yet, even in pain, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about that day in the woods. The scarred German shepherd who had found him first had stayed by his side like an old friend instead of a dog trained for someone else. His name, Thomas had learned, was Valor, 8 years old, once part of a decorated military canine team, now part of the local search and rescue unit after his previous handler died in service. Since then, Valor had never fully bonded with anyone until now. Rachel Vance, the canine handler, noticed it too. She'd watched in quiet amazement as Valor ignored her commands to leave Thomas's side, choosing instead to stand watch by his hospital bed. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Rachel and Thomas would talk in low voices. She told him about Valor's past omissions, the scars, and the months of restlessness after losing his partner. And Thomas shared stories of his own, the years spent walking these woods, the times he'd pulled lost hikers from riverbeds, the long nights when he'd wondered if anyone noticed his work at all. One evening, Rachel brought a thick file to Thomas's bedside. "You should see this," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made Thomas's chest tighten. Inside were reports of new activity deep in the reserve places that hadn't been touched by official patrols in years. Unauthorized tire tracks, cut fences, and odd equipment buried under fresh snow. The same places those masked men had demanded access to before chaining Thomas to that tree. Thomas frowned. "They came prepared," he whispered, his voice rough. "They knew where to put me so no one would find me." Rachel nodded, her face pale. "And someone had to tell them where to look." The words settled heavy in the small infirmary room, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Suspicion began to bloom inside Thomas, cold and sharp like an icicle. Someone in uniforms, someone he might have trusted, had given those men a map, the schedules, the hidden spots no tourist would ever find. Thomas replayed old conversations in his mind, the offhand comments from the sheriff about budget cuts, the deputy who always seemed to know more than he should, the ranger who never stayed past his shift. But each thought felt like betrayal. Thomas hated that more than anything. Outside the window, the snowstorm finally eased, revealing the raw, quiet beauty of the forest. Yet Thomas could feel something deeper than winter in the air, a silence that wasn't peace, but the calm before something worse. Rachel returned the next morning, her expression tired but determined. "Sheriff Dalton wants to see you," she said. Thomas's breath caught for a moment. Dalton had been his boss, his mentor, and in some ways, almost like family. After 2 decades together, Dalton's heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway before the sheriff stepped inside, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He wore the same uniform, Thomas remembered, but his eyes seemed older, harder. They talked quietly at first, about the snow, the rescue, the pain in Thomas's frostbitten hands. But soon Dalton's questions felt too pointed. "Do you remember anything about those men? Anything at all?" Dalton asked, his tone careful. Thomas hesitated. "Not enough. But they knew the land too well. Someone told them where to go." Dalton's jaw tightened just slightly. So quick most people wouldn't have noticed, but Thomas did. As Dalton left, Valor rose from his spot by the bed, watching the sheriff until he disappeared down the hall. Thomas placed a shaking hand on the dog's back. You saw it too, didn't you? Valor didn't bark, but his steady presence was answer enough. Over the next days, Thomas forced himself to move despite the pain. He walked slowly through the station halls, seeing familiar faces that now seemed strange. Deputies whispered when he passed. Paperwork disappeared from desks where it should have stayed. At night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, with Valor lying at his feet, staring out at the moonlit snow. His mind kept returning to one truth. Someone had betrayed him, and they were still close. Rachel joined Thomas in the early mornings, her voice hushed over mugs of coffee that steamed. In the cold air, together they pieced together small clues. Missing pages from patrol logs, unsigned permits for equipment runs, radio calls that were never recorded. Each puzzle piece pointed toward a plan larger than simple poaching, something organized, hidden, and dangerous. One night, Thomas walked outside, Valor close by his side. Snow fell softly, muffling even their footsteps. That's when they saw it. Fresh tire tracks where none should have been, leading away from the old generator shed. Valor, ears perked, body tense. Thomas knelt beside him, heart pounding, as he traced the tracks with gloved fingers. Someone came back, he whispered. They wanted to make sure I stayed quiet. The next morning, Thomas met Rachel and spoke the words he'd been avoiding. Dalton knows more than he says. And he's not alone. Rachel nodded slowly. Then, we find proof. Before they try again. Thomas's ribs still hurt, but anger burned hotter than pain. He wouldn't let them bury the truth beneath snow and silence. Together, they made a plan. Rachel would keep the deputies busy with a fake equipment check. Thomas and Valor would head to the old patrol cabin Dalton had labeled unsafe for winter. Deep down, Thomas knew they wouldn't find just empty walls there. As Thomas strapped on his coat, Valor stood ready at his side, eyes alert, scar gleaming under the pale light. Thomas bent low, his breath turning to mist in the cold. Ready, partner, Valor barked once, sharp and sure. As they stepped into the forest, the air felt different, heavy, with secrets and danger. Snow crunched underfoot, the only sound, in a world that seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the truth Thomas had almost died for, but he didn't know yet that what waited inside the cabin would change everything and that the betrayal ran deeper than he ever imagined. Asterisk. The old patrol cabin stood half buried under fresh snow, its roof sagging from years of neglect. Thomas paused at the edge of the clearing, his breath coming out in small white clouds. Valor stood beside him, muscles tense, ears forward, eyes locked on the weather-worn door. In that silent moment, Thomas felt everything around him sharpen the cold against his skin. The thud of his own heartbeat, the weight of the truth waiting to be uncovered. They moved closer, each crunch of snow underfoot loud in the stillness. Thomas gripped the old latch, heart pounding, and pushed the door open. The inside smelled of damp wood and cold air, but that wasn't all. In the corner, hidden under a torn canvas top, lay boxes marked with government stamps, boxes that should have been in the station's secured storage. Valor's nose twitched as he stepped forward, sniffing at the boxes. Then at a set of fresh boot prints, half covered by drifting snow. Thomas pulled the canvas aside and froze. Inside were maps of the reserve, marked with hand-drawn routes and notes in hurried handwriting. There were forged access permits, radio codes, and payment ledgers, proof of illegal land deals, logging contracts, and something worse. His chest tightened. This was bigger than he'd feared. Someone had turned Bitter Creek into a quiet trade of secrets and stolen land. And whoever chained him to that tree hadn't planned for him to find any of this. Just then, a floorboard creaked behind him. Thomas spun around, heart in his throat, only to see Sheriff Dalton standing at the door, snow clinging to his boots and jacket. Dalton's face held no surprise, only exhaustion, maybe even regret. "I was hoping you wouldn't find this," Dalton said, his voice low. "It didn't have to go this far." Thomas's throat felt dry. "Why?" he rasped. Dalton stepped inside, the old floor groaning under his weight. This place was dying. Thomas, budget cuts, empty patrols, nobody caring what happened out here. They offered money enough to keep the station alive, enough to help everyone. But you wouldn't let it go. The words felt like stones dropping into cold water. Thomas shook his head. "You chained me to die," he whispered. Dalton's eyes flickered. "That wasn't the plan. You weren't supposed to get hurt, just scared enough to walk away." Valor growled, low and dangerous, standing between them. Dalton's hand drifted toward his belt where his service weapon hung, but Thomas stepped forward. "Don't," he said. voice raw. It's over. Dalton hesitated, his shoulders sagging. In that moment, Thomas saw not just the sheriff, but the man who'd once taught him to read trail signs, who'd shared coffee on freezing mornings. It made the betrayal cut deeper than any wound. But outside, other footsteps broke the heavy silence. Rachel appeared at the doorway, her gun lowered but ready, eyes flicking between the two men. "We have the proof," she said quietly. Dalton let out a long breath, the fight leaving his eyes. Deputies moved in behind Rachel, handcuffs ready. Dalton didn't resist as they led him outside into the snow, his figure sinking into the white that had once been his domain. Later, Thomas stood at the station, the evidence boxes stacked neatly on the conference table. Deputies whispered quietly. Rachel filled out reports with tired determination. Valor lay by Thomas's feet, his head resting gently against Thomas's boot, eyes half closed but still watching every corner of the room. Thomas felt the weight of everything: betrayal, relief, and the strange emptiness left by truth finally revealed. The federal investigators arrived before dusk, combing through every file, every drawer, every radio call that might fill in the missing pieces. Rachel walked over, handing Thomas a fresh mug of coffee. "We did it," she said softly. "They can't hide it anymore." Thomas nodded, but his gaze drifted to the window, where snow kept falling, quiet, patient, as if nothing had changed. Days turned into weeks. The news spread quickly: respected sheriff arrested, an illegal land trade uncovered, and the story of the forest ranger who survived against impossible odds. Journalists came, cameras rolled, and Thomas found himself speaking not just about betrayal, but about the silent heroes who'd made it all possible. The canine German shepherds. Valor, once seen as a retired dog with too many scars, became a symbol of something larger. His quiet loyalty, his courage in the face of danger, and the bond he'd chosen to make with Thomas reminded everyone that bravery isn't always loud. It sometimes walks on four paws, steady and unshakable. One evening, as the station finally felt calm again, Thomas walked to the edge of the forest where it all began. Valor walked beside him, their breaths rising into the cold air. Thomas knelt, resting a hand on the dog's thick fur. "I would have given up out there," he whispered, voice catching. "But you didn't." Valor pressed closer, his tail sweeping the snow. And in that small, silent moment, Thomas understood what he hadn't before. Sometimes, the ones we think need saving are the ones who save us instead. They turned back toward the station, lights glowing warm against the falling snow. The forest behind them still held secrets, but tonight, the truth had finally come to light. And for Thomas and Valor, it wasn't just the end of a story, it was the start of something new, built not on silence and fear, but on trust that never let go.